Hi everyone, welcome to The Lost Generation, outside of the mainstream. My name is William Hooker. I am a musician, poet, and part of this generation of artists. My goal with this podcast, which is being broadcast on its own YouTube channel and my website, williamhooker.com, is to introduce you to many of the musical artists that are outside of the mainstream and have made important artistic contributions to our culture. I have also interviewed producers of the music and many fans and supporters of this work. My guests are sharing what makes this art form unique and significant. I hope these conversations will inspire you to listen to the music, which may change you in the way you view music, which again is outside of the mainstream. Today, we are interviewing poet and raconteur Steve Dalachinsky. I hope to be airing new interviews on the first of each month. We are presenting these interviews on our own YouTube channel. We have so many amazing interviews coming up that you will be hearing in the future. This is The Lost Generation, outside of the mainstream. This is a story that needs to be told. See you next month. I'm William Hooker, and I'm going to ask my friend Steve Dalachinsky something about the lost generation that I've been thinking about for a while. And Steve, what do you think are these persons' contributions to the music? And I'll give you individual names and you can just tell me what you think. First person, Burn Nix.
First, I like to say that the idea of recognition and what one gets or deserves is both very subjective and objective, and I think it depends on what one thinks he is due and how he goes about getting it, and how much external and internal factors are responsible for this, which sometimes is a choice that is made. As far as Byrne, I think Byrne, due to his personality, didn't put himself out there as much as he could. I don't think he had enough backing, despite the fact that he had a career with both two great artists of our time, Ornette Coleman and Jane Cortez. But in a way, due to my lack of overt knowledge of Byrne, I think he was both a unique individual and as a guitarist, especially coming from the harmonic tradition, had a unique sound within the tradition he was coming out of.
Great. Craig Harris.
Craig always had this very tough, what seemed like a tough side to him, but I think he's one of the greatest people I know. He's always been a human being to the arts and to me personally. Craig was one of the first cats I heard in the 80s who turned around my idea of what the trombone can do as an instrument. He's one of the first guys I heard who took the trombone into the high register. He brought it to a place that for me was made it way more palatable to me, except maybe when I was younger in the 60s and experienced Roswell Rudd and what he did with Archie Shepp. So, yeah, for me, Craig, number one human, number one musician.
Will Connell.
Will, I knew even on a more personal level than Craig. I thought Will was a great human being. He was a wonderful player. He did so many important things. Again, the connection to Ornette, which being a transcribe, is that the right word? Transcribing music and whatnot. Um, so he did a lot of, I think, and maybe people would slight me for saying this, but I think Will was one of those artists who did more in the background than he was given credit for. And when he did come up front as an artist, he was also very humble. But I had talks with Will where, he showed me how outspoken he can be. But he, and it's hard if I don't want to go into unique or not unique as a player, but he's a wonderful player on the instruments he chose. He had a great mind, and he was a sweetheart. And I think, like Byrne, he possibly did not have that, and I don't like calling it a quality, but he did not have that, I don't know what word to use, but he couldn't promote himself the way a lot of people do. And some people that you and I know well, who I never thought could promote themselves, but ended up doing it pretty good. Yeah, I mean, Will was one of those overall, in my experiences with him, my general experience with him, one of those, quiet giants.
Beautiful.
And I don't think he ever accomplished what he could have, even though he was, getting older. I think he could have accomplished a lot more. And he was finally getting to that point. But, again, and I know you want me to keep it short, but because there's so many divisions within these scenes, whether it's poetry or music, there's so many divisions that, even if we love a lot of the people in the so-called major scene we've been involved in, and for lack of a better term, we'll call it, there are a few different downtown scenes, but we'll call it the downtown free jazz scene if we want to.
Yes, yes.
I think not enough of those people who have, I don't even like to use this word, but let's say who have greatness in them,
Mm-hmm.
or can transcend their own abilities, get a chance to be outside that scene,
Mm-hmm.
where I mean to really expand within other scenes where possibly knowledge of them could, well, they still might be overlooked, but the knowledge of them could be greater.
Wow.
And I think Will was one of the people like Byrne, because of some of the people he actually worked for, who had way transcended. I don't know if it's a shortcoming in one's own being, or it's something they preferred not to do,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
or maybe simply for safety felt comfortable in the scene they were
Absolutely.
in. There's so many questions whether the person's alive or not anymore that we'd have to ask that person. Like Roy. I know Roy Campbell, what some of his ambitions were, but he also stayed very much rooted in place.
Well, we won't talk about Roy
Okay,
right now.
yeah.
I'm going to ask you about David Ware.
David Ware was a guy who, sometimes on a personal level, I had some problems with David's sound, which was very big. But the one thing I always said about David, and I would stand up for this, anywhere, anytime. David was one of the few people, whether, he studied with Sonny Rollins or whatever his formidable background might have been, who was completely unique on his instrument. His sound was nobody's sound.
Do you think that was part of his contribution to this music?
As an overall?
In terms of the Lost Generation, was that one of his?
I would say David's. Yeah, I would say
part of
David's.
his contribution.
I would say David's biggest contribution as an artist was, yes, he did something that very few people on his instrument have done articulately and clearly, which is he created a unique sound. And within that sound he created, and again, speaking as a non-musician, I wouldn't know how to say it in musical terms. He also developed a harmonic way of playing within what may sound to some people as a very static and monochromatic playing, but which contained so many colors, and his intensity and energy as a, I wrote something recently where loud doesn't mean powerful, but in the case of some people, David being one of those, he was. I wouldn't use the word loud. I mean, I use the word loud for guys I know, like young guys who think
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think David was
Beautiful.
bold, and I would say, even though the sound to some might feel loud,
Right.
I would say it was more big, a big sound. Like his mentor, Sonny Rollins at his best, has a big sound. But Sonny comes from a different tonal place.
Right.
So
right.
I would say David contributed, a big sound that was unique to David, and a certain way of where he kept the energy at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Within an ebb and flow that was almost not visible, which is really very difficult to do.
It is, and I recall, Steve, having to ask David to perform my piece on my very first recording, and when he asked how did I want him to play it, I said, and I knew that this was perfect for him. I said, play it with majesty. Because he made that contribution, I think, in terms of his stance with the tenor.
Yeah, I would say majesty is also a word that can be very personally taken, how one objectively and subjectively. Because,
Majestic.
Right, majestic. But, also the thing is because I deal with language, so I look at language in that way. Like, David once, I think it was a solo concert, talked very heavily about his spirituality.
Absolutely.
And how that filters through his playing.
Absolutely.
And now the thing is, that's also something that one ear can hear and maybe one ear can't hear. I think the ones who don't like where Coltrane went, for me, I understand, for some reason, I understand is a bad word because I don't think any of us understand anything, but I get Coltrane's spirituality.
Yes.
I got it from the first minute I heard it.
Yes.
So, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who don't get anything about Coltrane, particularly the latest stuff. Like when I tell people now I think Interstellar Space is a major masterpiece. No matter how much I love Supreme, Interstellar Space is what I prefer. Just like with Miles Davis, I prefer a certain period rather than the period I thought I preferred. Like, the Miles Smiles period. And with David, when you listen to David at the beginning, with Cooper Moore or, Flight of Eye, and not Flight of Eye, the one he did for Hadad, I just blocked the name of it out. And then you go to later, I know what David I like the best, but David was consistent. David was, to be really honest, if we talk about that sound, like Coltrane, you can follow every move he made. With Miles, it was almost there from when he started. With Monk, almost there from the first Monk year. And the same with one of my heroes, Dolphy. You put on a Dolphy record, whether it was when he played, in California with, I forgot the big band, Roy someone, or when he went from there to Chico Hamilton, even if his sound got bigger and somewhat more expansive, but, almost the first Dolphy you hear on record, it's almost a complete Dolphy as a sound. And then, as a composer and whatnot, he grew exponentially so quickly, just like that.
Do you think that...
And I think David was like that. I think David's sound
right.
and his ideas were already pretty formed. I mean, I could be wrong because I haven't heard David like when he was, 15 or 18.
Sure.
Before he was on record. But I'd say everything I've heard on record, he got stronger with that big sound, but that sound was always there.
But not only him. I'm trying to probe you about how you feel about this lost generation we're speaking about and the consistency of those people's sounds, because you did mention many people that are of the era before us. My question to you is that something you see consistent in those players that have developed a certain mastery in this generation that we're speaking of as well? People like Roy Campbell, people like Billy Bang, people like William Parker, people like Khan Jamal, people like J.D. Perrin. Do you feel that about many of us? Or
I think everybody has an individual voice. I like Khan Jamal. When I heard him, I thought he was a really good vibe player. Yeah. I don't know if he extended or expanded the language, and I don't know his overall work well enough from beginning to end to say that. With Roy, I think Roy, speaking earlier before the film about Lee Morgan was Roy's mentor. I think Roy was sometimes an inconsistent player, but when Roy was completely on target, he was always on fire. And Roy was, no matter whether he was writing tunes that were easy for us to hum, he was an example of continually growing as what I call an inside-outside player. Now, William.
No, stick with Roy for a second.
So because
and
he's my birthday brother. So,
oh wow, yeah. Because I really want to.
Roy and I had a very special bond, as I know Roy had with other people as well. But and Roy and I were two of the. He's one of the only people, except for maybe one or two others who are no longer with us, who we could talk on the telephone and we could say how we felt about people and things and the scene. And I need that a lot. And I don't find that enough. And, people just think I'm a big complainer, but some of my complaining is justified and some is unjustified, just being a bitter old guy. But like someone once said to me, I don't wear my bitterness well. I understood exactly what she meant, but, I
think you're on target.
I was also talking to someone who, like, married a really rich guy and lived in a huge loft.
I think you're on target.
Whatever. But I don't wear my bitterness well. But aside from that, Roy wasn't too good at wearing his bitterness well either. And I know some people who liked Roy, or maybe even loved Roy and his playing, but they would say to me, man, Roy, they said, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, I know. I mean, Roy's got some very, and of course these are, we all look at what we're saying as, wow, that's the be-all and end-all. But I think Roy knew that he was speaking for Roy.
But are we talking about his personality or are we talking about his music?
I think both. I think Roy was always speaking for Roy. I think Roy was very aware of his roots.
Yeah.
He knew he was coming out of people like Booker Little and Lee Morgan, and he knew he was developing a place in jazz.
Great.
And I think I can't say where he would have gone. I mean, like, I feel really even weirder because I was talking to Roy the night he died, and I was going to walk him to the train, and he was taking a long time to pack up, and it was one of those gigs. There were more guys in the band than in the audience.
That's very insightful.
And I said I'll call you on Monday because I had just did something that's very rare for me to be able to do. I got him a good gig in a museum for good bread, right. And the thing is, poof, then the next day I'm supposed to talk to Roy. He wasn't there anymore. So it was really a freak out for me. So, the thing is, and Roy and I did gigs together, and, I was once part of a gig that, the curators in their own way didn't want me part of, and Roy said, I want you to come up there and read a poem about Coltrane. And
absolutely.
I said, great, and Roy wanted me there. I was there. There's a few. I mean, now I do that for lots of people if they ask me
Well,
because I've broadened my horizon.
That attests to Roy's spirit.
Yeah.
And his feeling of in my thinking, Steve. Roy was a giver.
Yeah.
Roy was a giver, and I don't know. A lot of people, they shelter themselves. Roy was not like that.
He was a very exposed cat.
He was not like one of these people who even if he knew you or didn't know you, he was open to the point of I want to know you.
Right, but he also was able to do one thing that I've never been good at, which is if it was a circumstance where he had to be okay to the people, he kind of could do that in public. Not all the time, but sometimes. I find it very hard to do it in public if, sometimes I think about, oh, I know that cat did this and I never liked that, but, the person themselves, we get along fine. But, sometimes if there's somebody in public that I feel is wrong or fake or whatever, it's very difficult for me. He was a little better with that, and then he let it out on the telephone.
I hear you.
I think if I knew how to navigate at now being almost 71 years old, without having any formal education, I think I'd get a little more than I'm getting, and some of what I've gotten, that's kind of okay. And then there are those people who think, probably even with Roy, he's getting way more than he thinks he's getting, because a lot of us want, everybody, whoever they are, whether they're zillionaires or poor people, we all want more than we have. And that goes for recognition of our artwork.
That's true.
And for our being as human beings. Like, I want people, if people don't like parts of my personality, I would like them, if they don't want to deal with me, that's okay, but maybe you can't separate the person from their art. I found that out with someone whose music I love dearly. But maybe it's time you should separate the person from their art, unless you don't like their art either. That's cool. Like a guy who doesn't, like me or my wife, and even went so far as threaten me. We don't know why. He's a fellow artist. We used to share so many things in common.
I get it.
So if you don't like something, say it. But the problem is, most people don't want to rock the boat, and a lot of people are afraid I'm going to rock the boat. And I think some people felt that way about Roy, because some people would come up to me and say, "Man, Roy just talked to me and blah blah blah." I said, "Yeah, I talked to Roy an hour or so the other night." Now, how much of that Roy? I always looked at Roy and I knew when he was happy and when he wasn't happy, and sometimes that had nothing to do with the music. But the bottom line is, at least Roy felt comfortable enough that if he couldn't vent it anywhere else, he could call me or some other people and say, "Man, I don't like the way this is."
Louis Dalachinsky. You want to pass the note? Okay, fine. I'm good.
I will say one thing about Louis.
Yeah.
I was at a gig I was part of with Louis, and it was the first time he heard Rashid Ali play.
Yeah.
And Louis said to me, asked me if I knew him. I said yes, so I introduced the two of them, and that's what started that bond with him and Rashid.
Great.
When Louis first started playing, the first time I heard Louis play was a solo, and then the second time I heard him was with this Michelle Kinney, who moved out of New York. She was a cello player.
I remember
And to be
her.
really honest, what struck me about Louis' playing was he was Zorn's only student. I heard him in the knot room.
You're absolutely right.
I heard him in the knot room at the old knitting factory. And Louis was playing something on the saxophone that wasn't really Zorn, but was not jazz. And Louis, you might hate me for saying this, but I loved that part of Louis' playing way better.
I hear you.
As as what I considered a non-jazz language.
Yes.
Because it was something that, when I heard it, I remember exactly when the first time I heard Louis. I was sitting in the bar outside the knot room of the knitting factory on Houston Street, and I was with some German friends of mine. We were all getting drunk, and I heard something, and I said, "Guys, I got to take a walk 10 feet and go in that little room and see what's going on there. Louis played to very few people, maybe 5 people, even that. And I came out about a half hour later and said, man, this cat, he's doing something on the tenor that nobody's doing. And he was. So I love Louis playing, and I'm glad he, hooked up with Rashid. But there was a part of Louis playing before he got more involved in the Coltrane and jazz language that I, as a listener, I liked better.
Well, all right then. Trudy Silver.
I put Trudy on that list because I know Trudy for a very long time. I cannot really speak enough to her playing, although the first time I heard Trudy, her husband was promoting concerts, and he promoted one of Matt Shipp's early concerts.
Philip? Her husband is Philip.
No,
right?
he's not. No.
Bruce.
Bruce Morris. Bruce.
Okay.
So Bruce was promoting concert, and the concert was Trudy Silva, and I forgot who Trudy played with. It might have been Booker T. Williams, and Matthew was doing a duo with, I'm 90% sure, was Steve McCall. And it was one of Matthew's first concerts in New York that I remember.
Uh-huh.
And I thought Trudy was a really wonderful pianist.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes her projects, which is not because of her, it's just because of me, I'm not so into projects where there's a lot of talking and politicizing and blah, blah, blah. I like more when I'm hearing music to hear the music.
Wow.
Except in a rare case like Archie
Interesting.
Shepp on Fire Music, reading
Okay.
Malcolm or some great thing like that.
Right.
But so I thought I found Trudy to be a wonderful, wonderful pianist, and I don't think she's been allowed, for whatever reason that is, to play enough public concerts, and she's certainly and keeping 5C Cultural Center alive with Bruce is a big plus for the community, and I think she is one person who should get more recognition.
How many artist-run places do you know exist at this date? Not that many, I would think, right?
I think I found out only last year that I-Beam is artist run. Then Zorn.
In Manhattan?
Oh, in Manhattan?
Yes.
None except John's. And even though he's moving to the new school, it'll still be under his auspices. But I guess Trudy, John, and
That's difficult.
the
isn't it?
rare cat who may have a salon in his place or
That's
something
but that's
like
very
that.
difficult, isn't it?
Probably, yeah, I would say.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
'Cause she has to pay
That's
the rent for
actually
that.
artist run.
That's right.
Yeah, and other than Arts for Arts, which has a kind of, they're not always in the same place every year, although they've been pretty stable for the past few years. There's very few in Manhattan that are artist run. And I think, going back to what you asked me about Craig Harris, I think Craig is very, 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 he's involved with a church in Harlem,
Sure.
and I think he's very, really super involved and wants to make sure that what I can see him doing with David Murray, who's back in New York now, he really wants to maintain and heighten this idea of artist run.
Charles Gale.
Well, you know my history with Charles. I mean,
No, I don't know your history.
I haven't talked to Charles in a
I
very
read your poems.
okay. I haven't talked to Charles in a very, very long time, but
What's his contribution to this music?
like a famous poet who I once took to see Charles,
I like this.
she said to me after the gig, yeah, he's good, but I've seen it before. I've seen Albert Eiler and all that, and I said, I left it alone because I understood what they meant. But like when I first saw Charles, someone who doesn't come to music much anymore, Karen Burdick, before I got friendly with her, she was handing out a flyer in front of the knitting factory on Houston. I was going to see something. She gave me a flyer and she said to me, like someone said 20 odd years before that, but opposite. Someone when I was a kid said, as I was walking down McDougal Street, I know you like Cecil Taylor. You should go round the corner to Dayton's. There's a guy, he's a Cecil Taylor, the saxophone. His name is Albert Eiler. He's got his new record out, Bells. I went and bought Bells. There was Albert Eiler for me. And Karen said the exact opposite thing, but almost the same. She said, I know you like Albert Eiler, so you should come next week and hear the saxophone player, Charles Gale. I said, I got nothing to lose. That's the first poem in my book. And
Where was that?
it was at
Where'd
the
you go?
old knitting factory.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
just like the poem said, he's playing, and it was raining, and the little tree was whipping against the window. And there was me, my friend who passed away, John D'Agostino, the painter, and maybe three other people. And John talks more than I do. And I looked at him and said, wow. I went home, and the first thing I said to Hugo, I met a guy tonight who talks more than I do. And I said,
Charles Gale?
no, Don Charles
Oh.
Agostino.
Oh.
And I said, but we both love music, and this cat's history is incredible. And I said, I heard a saxophone player tonight. He renewed my faith in the music. And I said, you got to come with me. Next time she came, she felt the same way. I got, to use a terrible term, I got addicted to Charles. I went to almost every concert. And as you know by the book, I started writing a poem for every gig I saw.
Why did you go to every concert? What was it that was being fed?
What was being fed?
Yeah.
Most of the time, if I wasn't
In your
overly
words.
overly involved with myself,
No, in your
if I can
words.
get out of myself while he was playing,
Uh-huh.
he fed me everything I needed. Energy.
If you got out of yourself.
If you want to talk about spirituality, whatever that is,
Uh-huh.
I don't know what that is, but
Okay.
he fed me. He fed me
Yes.
so much power, both technical and manifest in his playing. So much of what I was yearning for every time I put on, and got whenever I put on the right Isla record or the right Coltrane record, or even less, players who were not that outside, like a good Horace Silver record even.
Okay.
I mean, he fed me what I needed from the music. I may not have always liked the rhythm sections or this and that. And at that point, Charles wasn't into the speeches, and he wasn't into the mime thing. He would just play literally facing the
understand.
wall,
I was there.
and he hardly spoke in the beginning. And musically, he nourished me. He gave me everything I needed,
Thank
and he gave me almost. Why I'm saying almost is because there's a point later in life where not everything an artist does works for you, or as much as I heard Cecil when I was a teenager, and sometimes later in life I would still know what he's doing, but my
Cecil Taylor.
yeah, but my brain wasn't reacting, because somehow you get closed sometimes, and nothing opens you up. But Charles gave me almost everything, and for me, the one thing that attests to that, beside me being able to talk about it, was even at a point where I realized what I was doing was becoming a book, and sometimes I would write the poem intentionally because I was already in this groove of writing a poem every time I heard Charles play. I even wrote a poem in there where I chose to go to a different gig instead of Charles's, and that gig someone managed to give me a recording. And there's one other gig I know I didn't write about because I missed it, going to an Oscar Brown Jr. concert, and I think constantly, wow, Charles played with Henry Grimes in a church. That was the only time. Maybe they played one other time together, and that was the first time. And you went, but I loved Oscar Brown Jr. It was a rare time to go see him,
Yeah, absolutely.
And, so it was a tough choice, But Charles always, even when I was intentionally starting to write poems, knowing this is a manuscript and I hope it gets published one day, I knew that unless a fluke happened, I'd walk out of there saying, wow, another great guy. And Yuko felt the same way. She came with me to almost every gig of Charles, and probably during that period, well, the book covers the 80s through 2006 or something, so I went to almost, except maybe a couple, almost every concert that I knew Charles was doing. I'm not a crazy guy. I'm not gonna do like other guys that know would jump in a car and go to Philadelphia to go to a concert, or Connecticut, or somewhere. But everything, except in a rare case where he was playing within the boroughs, when he played at Milford's house, wherever, I would try to be at that gig. And I was almost. I'm saying almost because it's safer to say that, but I would say I was almost never disappointed. What to me Charles contributed to the music, beside, if you listen carefully, a unique sound that comes out of other unique sounds, and a continuance and extension and on some levels expanding of the music that very few people have done.
He's a multi-instrumentalist, right?
Well, he started playing the piano a lot, and he claimed that that was his first instrument.
Okay.
There was a while, for a minute, he picked up the bass clarinet.
Sure.
It's all in that book. For 2 minutes, he picked up the violin.
Okay.
For 3 minutes, at the end, he started playing the bass a lot, which kind of wasn't my forte.
Okay.
And but he started to play everything. Like bass wasn't his trip, but he really needed to play the bass. So he took a lot of risks. And violin, it was like Henry Grimes or Ronette, that screechy violin.
Yeah.
But he felt he was a great bass clarinet player because he was such a great tenor player. But he didn't play. I wish he played more bass clarinet actually. And sometimes his piano is only Charles on the piano because you could tell at his best that he's a great piano player. But for me, it's his tenor. And probably like with the guy like David Murray, if Charles played more bass clarinet, I knew like David or Dolphy that he knew how to really handle the bass clarinet.
Sure.
So I would have liked a little more of that. But yeah, Charles just did for me what no one was doing for me in the music except maybe Cecil. And it's funny, at that time I still thought Cecil was being completely free form, and Cecil always had written stuff in front of him. Where Charles was one of the rare people who played a saxophone who from the get-go, he never... In fact, I saw him do one gig once with someone I love dearly, who I won't talk about, but it was a written music gig, and it, like Daniel Carter,
Right.
he could do it, he could read music, he just hated it.
It didn't work.
Well, it worked as good as it could work, but he just, like Daniel, doesn't like reading music, and Daniel could read the, Elliot Carter if he has to. He just, wants to play free. And Charles is one of the only musicians I've ever seen since maybe the 60s and certain loft jazz gigs I went to who played free from beginning to end.
Okay.
And, sometimes he'd bring in melodies, and the melodies were very close to Isler melodies because of Charles's, what ended up being a very heavy, almost right-wing, born-again God sensibility. And, when he did those speeches in public, I got great poems out of them. And some guys I knew, who I found out later were very important visual artists, said, why do you still want to go see him? He's talking, he's anti-abortion, he's talking to the wrong audience about this. I said, I understand that, but I said, you have to remember one thing. I love the guy's music, and I may not get along with him on a political or whatever level, and we used to talk on the phone for hours at a time for the first 5-6 years of our relationship, and we talked about everything. I mean, we went from Native Americans to slavery, and he once talked to me something about slavery, and I said something about Native Americans, and I thought he's gonna like jump on my case, and he said, wow, I never thought about it that way, you're right.
Did you ever hear him put any of those thoughts, those political or social thoughts, into music specifically?
I heard him put more of the...
Since everything was always spontaneous.
Well, if
music.
you read the titles of his music,
right,
it's very obvious. Not
Give me a
the
couple of them.
not the
Give me a couple of
politics, but like I can't give you titles.
just one. If you
Well, let's say it's not his title, but similar to Isler's titles like Spirits, Holy Ghost, those kind of,
Okay.
and but what you felt once you got a sensibility of where Charles was at. Yeah, one thing you felt. I don't know about the politics. He played that out in the mime stuff and in his speeches, but you felt the religious part, sure. You felt that when he said something about spirituality, because he might be coming from a God point that I didn't agree about.
Okay.
But yeah, he was very deep. And then when he played those Isler-esque type little melodies, and I once even said to him after his first recording session that I wrote the liner notes for, wow, man, so how do you think, I won't go into every detail about what he said about when I said I'm going to write the liner notes, but when I said, so do you feel you come out of Isler? A lot of people say you feel you come out of Isler. And at that point, He said to me, no, I come out of late Coltrane. And then later, of course, people were writing about him that he came out of Eiler. And I think he started to do what even I do sometimes now when someone says to me, great performance or something like that. I used to say, I don't perform. I'm not a performer. And I even said that to someone last week because I just got so bummed out. But, after a while, you accept that a little bit. It's just, okay, whatever they think. If they just can't say great concert, great poem, you did a good job, whatever.
Thank you for tuning in. In months ahead, you will have the opportunity to hear from many more Lost Generation artists and supporters. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to hear upcoming episodes.